My sister completely lost her mind after our dad casually mentioned updating his will. What started as an ordinary dinner chat turned into her personal investigation, complete with baby photo analysis like she was building a case file. And it didn't stop there, she actually tried replacing my DNA sample with her friend's spit. Yeah, you heard that right. I'll show you the exact moment I realized she crossed the line and how the tests proved it. It all began at that dinner table, when Dad made one simple comment that flipped a switch in her head. When Dad dropped the will update bomb, dinner that evening began the way it usually did, a plate of cheesy casserole in the middle of the table and a few laughs about how Dad still couldn't manage not to burn the garlic bread. Nothing about it suggested a shift was coming. Dad, in his early 60s, sat at the head of the table looking the same as always, relaxed, casual, more concerned about whether we ate some salad than anything else. Then he cleared his throat and, in a tone so flat it was almost background noise, mentioned that he'd started talking to a lawyer about updating his will. He said it as if it were a line item on his to-do list. It's time to get the paperwork straightened out. There was no build-up, no serious air, no dramatic phrasing, just the plain announcement. For most families, it would have been one of those moments where you pause, acknowledge the weight of it, and then move on. And in many ways, that's how I thought of it. After all, it made sense. He owned a successful contracting business he'd built from scratch. Mom had passed away several years earlier, and he only had 2 kids. Of course, he'd want everything documented clearly. To me, it felt like an ordinary step in responsible planning, nothing more. But across the table, my sister froze. The fork in her hand stopped halfway, her posture sharpened, and her eyes zeroed in on Dad like the words carried a hidden code only she could hear. Other families might share a little sadness thinking ahead to the idea of a parent's mortality, but that wasn't what flickered in her face. What I saw looked more like calculation. Her casual presence from a moment before snapped into something tense, suspicious, and directed first at Dad, then at me. Meanwhile, the rest of dinner stayed light. Dad spooned himself another portion, asked me if the salad needed more dressing, and carried on humming under his breath. From his perspective, it was nothing more than responsible housekeeping. But she didn't see it that way. The announcement seemed to trigger a switch, as if updating the will wasn't just legal paperwork but the beginning of a bigger game where every detail mattered. Watching her, I realized she wasn't grieving or taken off guard by the topic itself. She was sorting through possibilities in her head. The sharp stillness in her expression told me she was already considering how this news might affect her standing. That pause, that sudden silence, would turn out to be important later. The rest of the night carried a strange imbalance. Dad rinsed plates, humming an off-key tune while I stacked dishes beside him. Everything about his behavior was calm, ordinary, the same man we'd always known handling chores. But she lingered in the background, not really helping, keeping her gaze fixed on me in a way that felt off. Her silence carried more weight than anything she could have said. By then, I understood that something had shifted in her, and that shift wasn't going to fade once the meal ended. What she pulled from that single sentence about the will was more than what Dad actually offered. To him, it was about making sure documents existed for the future. To her, it was an invitation to search, to question, and to treat me less like her sibling and more like a rival. It was the subtle beginning of suspicion that would color her every move. That dinner with slightly charred bread and an unremarkable casserole didn't look like much on the surface, but it set the tone for everything that came afterward. The tension in her eyes that night was the first clear signal of what was to follow, when those suspicions found the smallest, strangest ways to express themselves. And within days, she would find her first excuse to act on them. Her baby photo investigation begins. It started with something small, the kind of detail so ordinary you wouldn't guess it was the beginning of anything. A week after that dinner, I was at Dad's place again, sitting in the living room while he dozed in his recliner. I was half scrolling on my phone, half listening to the quiet hum of the TV. My sister crouched by the coffee table, pulling out the old photo albums Dad kept there. At first, it looked harmless. People flipped through those albums all the time, usually to laugh about bad haircuts or ridiculous outfits. But she wasn't laughing. She leaned closer and closer to each page, her breath fogging the plastic sleeves like she thought she was examining fingerprints at a crime scene. Her focus wasn't general nostalgia either. She wasn't just browsing, she was studying me. She held up one picture of me as a baby propped on a blanket, my head too big for my body and my face twisted mid-cry, the usual look for a newborn. But instead of flipping the page with a smile, she whispered, "That doesn't look like Dad at all." I actually laughed, thinking it was a joke. I said something about how all babies resemble little aliens, but she didn't move a muscle. Her finger traced the photo, slowly pointing out my nose, my eyes, the space between them. Too narrow, too wide. Doesn't match. Hearing her talk this way was unsettling. Not only because she sounded convinced, but because we were sitting only a few feet away from Dad. He was asleep and oblivious, but even so, it felt weirdly humiliating, like I was being accused of not belonging in my own family while the man she was calling into question sat a few feet away. She kept flipping through, and with each new page she came up with another theory. A shot of me at my first birthday, frosting smeared across my shirt. She tapped on my ears and whispered that they didn't match hers. Another photo where Dad was holding me in his lap. She compared our eyebrows and claimed mine tilted at the wrong angle. These weren't analyses in the spirit of teasing, not the kind of nitpicking where siblings poke fun at one another for bad childhood pictures. She was whispering to herself, feeding her own theories, convincing herself with every detail. The level of seriousness was almost funny, if not so uncomfortable. She tilted the pages under the lamp like she expected to find watermarks. She squinted close enough to fog up the plastic covers. I wanted to laugh it off, so I threw in sarcasm. Yep, clearly toddlers can fake their identities, you've cracked the case. She glanced at me without smiling, as if my jokes were irrelevant noise in the middle of her investigation. Her face didn't soften, her grip on the album didn't relax. The seriousness made it eerie. The so-called evidence she used was flimsy to the point of absurd. My cheeks not round like hers, my baby hair appearing too light under the flash, my forehead being too wide. She pointed out eyebrow shapes, even though the photos were so grainy it was impossible to make out if eyebrows were even visible. None of it made sense if you thought about genetics in any rational way. Kids inherit traits unevenly. Some don't look like either parent, some look like a grandparent, or even like no one in particular until years later. None of that mattered to her. She was weaving it into her own story. What got to me most was the tone she used. Growing up, she used to mock my awkward school pictures the way siblings always do. That was normal, but this wasn't that. She muttered softly like she was correcting herself or building a secret record. And then when she thought she found something, she would glance at me like she was daring me to deny it. At one point, she leaned close and whispered, "You don't look like either of them, not in any of these photos." The way she said it carried weight, less like a taunt and more like a fact she was logging away. I tried reasoning with her. I explained how traits skip generations, how biology works, how sometimes siblings don't even resemble each other. I even offered a silly counterpoint, pointing at her awkward childhood bowl cuts and crooked teeth as the real suspicious material. I thought humor might break through, but she just pressed her palm on the closed album and muttered, "Something S off," and the way she said it, quiet and curt, made it clear she wasn't letting go anytime soon. By then, Dad had woken and wandered into the kitchen asking if anyone wanted tea. He didn't notice the vibe at all, didn't see her leaning over photos like they contained hidden codes. To him, the night moved on as usual. But for me, sitting there while she whispered conspiratorial comparisons to my face, it was awkward in a way I couldn't shake. It was a mix of being hurt, like she was erasing my place in the family right in front of me, and being worried about how locked in she seemed. I cracked jokes later in the car ride home, telling myself she'd drop it once she realized how ridiculous baby photo forensics really were. Maybe she'd laugh when she thought about it. That was the expectation. People get fixated in the moment, then the spell breaks. But the thing was, she wasn't joking. She was committed. The more absurd her findings sounded to me, the more convinced she seemed by them. That's when it sank in. These albums weren't just a trip down memory lane for her. They were her starting point, her first place to dig. What looked like her mumbling over old snapshots was really her gathering what she considered proof, building a case for something only she believed. And when someone treats faded childhood moments like the cornerstones of a grand theory, it doesn't just resolve itself quietly, it grows. Because if you start telling yourself that baby photos are evidence, the next step is taking that theory outside the photo albums into places where other people can hear it. And soon, that's exactly what she did. From sister to full-time conspiracy theorist. It wasn't long before her private muttering turned into a public act. What started as whispered comparisons over old baby photos found a much louder stage at family gatherings. She folded her suspicions into everyday conversations as if they were small talk, only the subject wasn't sports or work, it was me. The first time I realized how far she'd take it was at a cousin's birthday. I walked into the kitchen and caught her speaking to two relatives, her plate balanced in one hand. She was pointing at me without saying my name, whispering like she was dropping government secrets. "His jawline doesn't match Mom's or Dad's. Doesn't that seem off?" When I stepped into the room, she didn't stop, didn't act embarrassed. Her eyes flicked up, locked on mine, and she finished her thought with purpose. That glance carried a sting. She wanted me to hear, wanted me to feel exposed in front of people I cared about. My cheeks grew hot, not just from anger, but from that hollow, awkward feeling of being under scrutiny when you don't deserve it. It didn't stop at parties. At family dinners, she laced comments into otherwise normal conversations. Dad would be talking about his work or the latest fishing trip he wanted to plan, and she'd lean toward an aunt or uncle with that calculated tone. "Don't you think it's strange he doesn't resemble Dad at all?" The table would go stiff. People would shift in their seats, not sure how to respond. I'd force a smile to show I wasn't rattled, but inside it burned. Being reduced to a topic like that, treated as a curiosity instead of a person, it bruised in a way you can't joke off. She wasn't looking for laughs either, that was the unsettling part. There was no smirk, no lightness in her delivery. It wasn't harmless ribbing. She spoke with a clipped seriousness, repeating herself as if she needed the words to take root in someone else's mind. If someone called her on it, asked what she meant, she'd lower her voice like she was letting them in on something privileged, as if she had classified evidence tucked away at home. It made people uncomfortable, and it left me feeling like I was sitting at a table where the spotlight glared solely on me and everybody else was waiting to look away. Escalation showed itself most clearly when she pressed our uncle during one dinner. Forks scraped plates, the conversation floated around the table, and suddenly she leaned in with, "Don't you find it odd he has none of Dad's features?" The pause that followed felt like static in the room. My uncle tried to laugh it off, but she didn't let up. Instead, she asked again, slower, sharper, "Doesn't it make you curious?" That left me stunned. It wasn't hypothetical anymore, it was an open declaration. With every repetition, she stripped away pretense, stepping deeper into this self-imposed role of truth-teller. Watching her, I wasn't just embarrassed, I was unsettled. It was clear she saw herself as on a mission. That was the turning point, when her suspicion hardened into something resembling a campaign. The comments weren't accidents and they weren't impulsive. She was deliberate, planting seeds at every opportunity, making sure more eyes landed on me with doubts. What had felt like quirky curiosity in the photo albums turned into a steady pulse of accusations. Every event became a platform, and every relative became her audience. When she pulled our grandmother aside during a holiday evening, I finally admitted to myself how far gone it was. The family was unwrapping gifts, chatter buzzing around the room, and she sat beside Grandma speaking low enough that it looked like a private conversation. I passed by just in time to hear my name paired with the same tired claims. I turned, thinking she'd drop it once she realized I'd overheard. But she didn't stop. She kept talking, staring straight at me as she finished her sentence. That moment cut deeper than the rest. It wasn't just humiliating, it made me realize she wanted me to feel isolated. She wasn't avoiding my awareness of what she said, she thrived on it. By then, the repetition told me everything. This wasn't some temporary fixation or a one-off theory that would die in a few weeks. She had chosen this path and committed to it completely. It wasn't attention-seeking dressed up as gossip. It was hostility dressed up as righteousness. The longer it went on, the clearer it became. She wasn't just suspicious, she was determined to cast me as the outsider in our family. And the embarrassment I felt in those moments slowly gave way to anger. Even so, her behavior carried an odd duality. Outside of those accusations, she could act perfectly normal, joking about TV shows, talking about food, even teasing me the way she always had. But the normalcy never lasted. The accusations always came back, slipped in like rehearsed lines she couldn't resist performing, and with each new delivery, that campaign sharpened. I reached a point where I stopped expecting it to fade. Instead, I braced myself at every gathering. Who would she corner this time? What angle would she try? There was a heavy feeling in my chest, the awareness that I couldn't escape being her subject no matter how ordinary the night seemed. Looking back, I think that was when my disbelief finally cracked. I couldn't tell myself she was in a phase anymore. It was something deeper, something she had convinced herself into believing, and once a person believes at that level, arguments don't pry them out of it. And that's how the slide felt, from casual suspicions born over photo albums to something bigger, something that carried the weight of intention. It wasn't curiosity anymore. She had stepped into a self-assigned role, and with every whisper and every raised eyebrow she made it clear that to her I wasn't her brother, I was the question mark she wanted to expose. If you were me, would you have confronted her sooner or let it play out? The shift in her behavior didn't end at family dinners or whispered comments. It continued building, moving from gatherings into my daily life, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Emails, articles, and DNA propaganda. The way she expanded her theory beyond family gatherings showed just how far she was willing to take it. Suddenly, my inbox became the new battleground. At first, I expected the kind of random link siblings usually send, memes, recipes, or a funny video. Instead, she filled my email with stories she clearly thought would prove her point. These weren't lighthearted. They were heavy-handed articles about people finding out they were adopted or uncovering hidden family ties through DNA tests. She didn't just send one, she sent 3 different articles in the span of a week, each one centered on dramatic reveals where someone discovered their real family wasn't the one they grew up with. To her, these weren't coincidences. They were pieces of evidence building her case against me. Each subject line screamed like a tabloid headline, "DNA tells the real story," or "Hidden truth in your blood." One link described a man who took a mail-in DNA test and discovered his dad wasn't his biological father. Another told the story of siblings who sued each other after a genetic mix-up came to light. The third was about a young woman blindsided to learn she was adopted after comparing results with a cousin. They weren't polished scientific journals, more like blogs or copy-pasted news clippings, but she treated them like case law. I'd open my laptop in the morning expecting work emails and find myself ambushed by her curated catalog of suspicion. Coffee barely in hand, I'd see a subject line practically shouting at me to pay attention. The persistence was what made it impossible to brush aside. It wasn't just one article or an occasional food for thought. It was a drip feed. Every time I ignored an email, she followed up with a message that landed heavy. "Did you read that one? Or this one feels relevant to you?" She framed it as if she was doing me a favor, sharing resources I should appreciate. In her mind, the inbox wasn't spam, it was her evidence locker, delivered directly to me, the unwilling detective she expected to accept the case. She didn't stop at emails. She tried to bleed it into conversation too, like testing her slogans in different environments. One phrase stuck out: "DNA doesn't lie." She repeated it like a chorus line. At dinner, while passing dessert, she'd drop it suddenly: "DNA doesn't lie." During board games, tucked between casual chatter, "DNA doesn't lie." Everyone else at the table would glance sideways, pretending not to notice, because what could they say? I sat there chewing pie, humiliated, while she inserted her catchphrase into moments like it was normal small talk. The way she timed it, waiting for lulls in conversation, moments when nobody could easily change the subject, made it clear she wasn't improvising. She was being strategic, pressing the message until it stuck. With me, the comments got even sharper. She started approaching me during quiet moments after gatherings when it was just the two of us. In hallways or as we lingered near the kitchen sink, she'd start in with, "Do you ever wonder about your real parents?" The emphasis she placed on real hit hard, like she was dangling insider knowledge. Other times it was, "Don't you think it's strange you don't look like us?" The words didn't come off like teasing anymore. They felt like interrogation, as if she thought persistence alone would crack me open into confession. It wasn't curiosity driving her tone, it was pressure. The escalation reached a late-night level too. Once she texted me just before midnight with a link to an image of a DNA testing kit. Beneath it she wrote, "This would settle everything." That wording, "settle everything," felt chilling. It wasn't pitched as a funny gag or a suggestion, it was presented as the solution, the quick fix to my supposed mystery. Reading it, I felt more insulted than anything. Not because I doubted who my parents were, but because she was trying to shove me into her twisted narrative like I owed her a written certificate of belonging. The more she leaned into this campaign, the more obvious her conviction became. She wasn't speculating anymore. In her head, she already had the answer. I wasn't really one of them. The emails, the slogans, the DNA kit photo, these weren't questions. They were demands disguised as persuasion. She already believed the conclusion. All of this was her way of dragging me there with her. Dad didn't notice any of it. He thought her sudden interest in genetics was just another one of her quirky hobbies, like the short tango dancing phase or the pottery wheel that sat untouched in his basement. He thought it was harmless exploration. What he missed was the edge in her delivery, the certainty in her eyes every time she looked my way. To him, it was a passing curiosity. To me, it felt like being recast in my own family drama as the outsider, over and over again. I tried handling it different ways. At first, I ignored her. Then I tried sarcasm, tossing half-jokes like, "Sure, next week you'll tell me I was swapped at birth with royalty." Finally, I went direct. I told her straight up that I didn't need a DNA test to confirm who my parents are. Every time she gave the same little smirk. It wasn't a smile. It was the kind of look you give when you think someone just denied an obvious truth. That expression stuck with me more than the words. It was proof, at least in her mind, that she knew something I didn't. What wore me down was the relentlessness of her campaign. It was like a steady drop of water landing the same way every day until you couldn't tune it out. Each email, each whispered line, each smug text added to the weight. Even when nobody else reacted, I carried that tension. And the most unnerving part was realizing it wasn't for show. She believed every word. This wasn't about attention. To her, this was already reality. That shift changed the way I saw everything. At the beginning, I thought she was being dramatic or grasping for attention. But after the weeks of articles, slogans, questions, and kits, I couldn't frame it that way anymore. This wasn't playful or speculative. It was a campaign she had chosen, and she was locked into it completely. By the time I recognized that, she had already started to shape her suspicions into something bigger. The private hints and casual slogans weren't enough anymore. She was preparing to present it as something thoughtful, something that looked selfless on the surface. And that's when her so-called big surprise for Dad came into play. The family bonding project pitch. When she finally rolled out her grand idea, she packaged it with the kind of polish you'd expect from a school presentation, except the stakes felt higher and the target was me. She called it a special family project for Dad, presenting the whole thing like a heartfelt surprise. At first I thought this would be harmless, a scrapbook, maybe a framed photo display, but she didn't just walk into the room with arts and crafts. She came in carrying a laptop bag, a folder of printed documents, and the kind of expression that said she had been preparing for weeks. She gathered everyone in the living room, dimmed the lights like it was movie night, and connected her laptop to the TV. What appeared on screen was a PowerPoint title slide adorned with fancy lettering, "Our Family Legacy Project." I'll note here for delivery, picture saying that in a deadpan, slightly bewildered tone because that's exactly how it felt watching her try to dress her obsession up as a heartwarming gift. Dad sat up straighter, instantly interested. Anyone hearing the phrase "Family Legacy Project" would expect something wholesome, but the second I saw it, my stomach sank. She began flipping through slides with the confidence of a lecturer. The first one was a diagram of our family tree. Certain branches were already filled out, others neatly marked with "to be confirmed." Dad leaned forward, intrigued. My sister's tone was calm, professional, even cheerful as she explained how this project would be a bonding activity for all of us, a gift to Dad that would let us preserve stories while also understanding our roots. To him, it sounded generous and thoughtful. To me, it was obvious. She was setting us up for a round of DNA testing disguised as sentimentality. Slide after slide reinforced her pitch. She showed maps of countries, timelines detailing each phase, kits ordered by this date, samples completed by this date, and family reveal night. She even included a mock-up of a labeled binder at the end, promising to collect results and photos into a keepsake. The organization was over the top. She outlined 2 DNA testing companies, complete with a comparison chart on pricing, tiers, and customer reviews, as if we were choosing mobile plans. Dad was impressed by her research. I sat there pinching the inside of my palm, barely holding back laughter at how absurd it looked to see a simple spit test wrapped in spreadsheets and graphs. Then she hit the requirement slide. This wasn't optional fun. According to her, every family member had to participate for the project to be whole. She spelled it out by name, pausing on me for emphasis. She exaggerated her smile while explaining how she had already ordered the kits and prepared instructions for each of us. On the TV screen, she displayed a picture of the exact kits, as though the sight of packaging alone would make us clap with excitement. Framed as a selfless gesture, it was actually a trap designed to corner me. Dad, of course, loved it. His face lit up the way it used to when we gave him handmade gifts in grade school. He nodded through her slides, remarking aloud about how fun it would be to trace our family's history. He reminisced about stories from his grandmother and speculated on what countries might show up in the results. To him, her presentation seemed thoughtful, meticulous, even moving. He had no clue he was applauding the very device she'd built to force my compliance. What struck me most wasn't the PowerPoint itself, but the way she chose her moment. She pitched the idea on a night Dad was in high spirits, relaxed and open with no reason to be on guard. The timing was no accident. If I had interrupted to name what her project really was, I would have looked bitter, maybe even ungrateful. How do you argue against something framed as a family bonding gift without sounding like you're against the family itself? She made sure there was no clean way to refuse. So I sat and listened, watching her unveil graph after graph, timeline after timeline. Her control over the narrative was as thorough as her slides. The last screen displayed a picture of a smiling family beneath the words "Our Journey Together." Dad clapped when she finished, literally applauded her. He called her thoughtful, said he was proud of her. In that applause, I felt the weight of how completely she had masked her true intention. The sentiment was plastered everywhere. She used words like love, roots, and togetherness. But underneath, the plan was transparent. She'd secured Dad's approval, and with it, the pressure on me. If I said no now, I'd be painted as the stubborn one who rejected an innocent gift. In her design, I was the piece of the puzzle everyone else held accountable for finishing. What made it even stranger was how excited Dad became. He wasn't just politely receptive, he was beaming, telling her how meaningful it would be to chart our family story. Hearing that gave me an almost guilty feeling because while he saw a project filled with connection, I saw the snare. He never suspected her motives. Nobody did. After Dad hugged her goodnight, she glanced at me with that same sharp, satisfied expression I'd seen before when she cornered me at gatherings. Not triumphant, not playful, just cold certainty. She didn't need to say anything, the look on her face said enough. She considered this a checkmate move, one I couldn't undo without unraveling everything Dad believed about her heartfelt surprise. Walking out that night, I realized the scope of what she'd pulled off. To everyone else, she'd just gifted Dad something clever and touching, the kind of present that sparks warm conversation. To me, it was clear she'd laid the groundwork for the outcome she wanted from the start, my DNA on file, dressed up as family nostalgia. And the hardest part was knowing I was alone in recognizing it. For days afterward, I tried to figure out my next move. Did I play along to spare Dad's excitement, or did I confront her in front of him and risk looking like I was rejecting a family tradition before it even began? She had framed it so perfectly that either choice came with consequences. And yet, I knew sooner or later I would have to face the kits themselves. The DNA sabotage plan revealed. When she finally handed me the DNA kit, I expected it to be a straightforward handoff, just another step in her so-called project. She insisted on keeping all the boxes at her apartment, claiming it would keep things organized. It sounded like typical bossiness, so I let it slide, but as soon as she passed me my kit, I noticed something was off. The box looked normal from the outside. Seal intact, paperwork in place, my name and birth date printed clearly. Nothing gave it away until I opened it. Inside, the collection tube wasn't empty. It already had saliva inside, thick enough that when I tilted the tube, it shifted. The sight stopped me cold. For a second, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some freak error at the factory sent me a used kit, gross but explainable. But with my personal info printed and attached, that excuse disappeared almost instantly. Someone had filled it on purpose. The disgust hit first, followed quickly by one sharp realization: she'd tampered with it. This wasn't a mistake, it was her attempt to hijack the test before I even participated. My heart raced as I raised the tube in front of her like evidence. "What is this?" I asked. "Why is there spit already inside?" She didn't flinch, she didn't look guilty. She smirked, shrugged, and muttered something about messing with me, claimed she thought it would be funny. But the way she watched my reaction, eyes locked, waiting to measure whether I'd catch on, made it obvious this wasn't a prank, so I pressed harder. "Whose spit is this?" After some half-hearted deflection, she said it. "Fine, it's Isabel's." She thought it'd be hilarious to swap it. Hearing her say the name made it disturbingly real. This wasn't some vague friend or an imaginary story. It was Isabel's DNA, intentionally dropped into my kit, wrapped up in paperwork that belonged to me. If I had trusted her and mailed it right away, the test would have produced results showing that I wasn't biologically tied to Dad when, in fact, it was never my sample in the first place.